11,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers built a monumental stone complex in what is now southern Turkey. They had no cities, no formal states. Agriculture was only just beginning to emerge. Yet they raised pillars weighing up to an estimated 20 tons and arranged them into massive ritual enclosures. The site predates the Egyptian pyramids by roughly 7 millennia, and after centuries of use, its builders deliberately buried the entire complex beneath thousands of tons of earth. The precise reasons remain debated. 2,000 years ago, a shipwreck in the Mediterranean preserved what appeared to be nothing more than a corroded lump of bronze. It sat unnoticed in a museum for over 50 years before researchers discovered what was hidden inside. More than 30 interlocking hand-cut gears forming a mechanical calculator. Nothing of comparable complexity would appear again in the surviving archaeological record for approximately 15 centuries. And on a remote Pacific island over 2,000 kilometers from the nearest continent, a community of just a few thousand people carved nearly 900 monumental stone figures. Some weighed close to 80 tons. They were transported across volcanic terrain without metal tools, without wheels, and without draft animals. These are not myths. They are well-documented archaeological sites supported by decades of excavation and research. Yet the closer we examine the evidence, the more it challenges simple explanations about how early societies organized labor, transmitted knowledge, and constructed meaning. Each time I revisit these sites, I am reminded that our understanding of ancient capabilities continues to evolve as new evidence is studied and reinterpreted. Tonight we explore 7 such sites, part 2 of the Ancient Mysteries series. As always, the visuals provide added context, but are not essential. Whether you're listening to relax, to work, or to fall asleep, get comfortable and let the outside world fade away. Consider subscribing if you'd like to follow future explorations. For decades, this hilltop in southern Turkey was thought to hold little of significance. Now we know otherwise. Let us begin. What if the traditional model of how civilization began has it backwards? What surprises me most about Göbekli Tepe is not just the age of the site, but how it challenges every assumption about the origins of human society. Archaeologists are still debating whether this was a place that shaped social awareness or simply a massive ritual center, and that debate itself tells you there are no simple answers. Around 9,600 years before the Common Era, humans in this region lived in small, mobile bands, sleeping in temporary shelters, following animal herds. No permanent settlements, no centralized leadership. Agriculture was only just beginning to emerge. Most groups typically numbered a few dozen individuals, though seasonal gatherings could be larger. Yet somehow these scattered groups built what is currently considered the oldest known monumental ritual complex on record. A complex of stone circles with pillars weighing up to an estimated 20 tons each, roughly the weight of 3 fully loaded trucks. Engineering simulations suggest that moving just one pillar may have required several hundred people working in coordination. If your entire community has 30 or 40 members, where do you find 300? Who convinces rival bands to set aside their differences and haul stone together? Who feeds them while they work, in a world where every meal depends on a successful hunt? And this was not a one-time effort. Construction continued for over 1,000 years. In 1963, a joint survey by the University of Chicago and Istanbul University examined a rounded hilltop in southeastern Turkey and concluded it was nothing more than a medieval cemetery. For nearly 30 years, archaeologists walked right over the site. Then, in 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt picked up a stone fragment and immediately recognized it had been shaped by human hands over 11,000 years ago. He would spend the remaining 20 years of his life excavating this hill. He passed away in 2014, but not before revealing what lay beneath: the oldest known monumental ritual complex ever discovered. Now picture yourself walking into one of these stone circles. The enclosure stretches roughly 30 meters across, about the size of a basketball court. 2 enormous T-shaped limestone pillars stand at the center, rising nearly 6 meters, roughly the height of a 2-story building. Their surfaces are covered with intricate carvings: foxes mid-stride, snakes coiling, birds of prey with outstretched wings. Along the edges, human hands are carved into the stone, as if these pillars were giant beings reaching out across millennia. On some, Belts and cloth are carved around the body, dressing these stone figures for a ceremony that ended thousands of years ago. Around them, smaller pillars form a ring connected by low walls, with smooth limestone floors and stone benches. And yet, there is limited evidence of domestic activity, such as hearths or long-term habitation. Current interpretations suggest this was primarily a place people traveled to for specific purposes, rather than a permanently occupied settlement. To grasp the age of what you are standing in, Göbekli Tepe was built roughly 6,000 years before Stonehenge and about 7,000 years before the Great Pyramids. The chronological distance between Göbekli Tepe and the pyramids exceeds the span separating the pyramids from the present day. The builders were nomadic hunters roaming a rich landscape of oak forests, vast grasslands, and diverse wildlife. Ground-penetrating radar has identified at least 20 separate circles at the site. Yet only around 5% has been excavated. What this means methodologically is that our current model of the site is statistically fragile. We are drawing large conclusions from a very small exposed sample. What has already been uncovered has significantly influenced current interpretations of early social organization, and it may represent only a fraction of what still lies beneath. Klaus Schmidt believed this was a ritual center dedicated to ancestors and death. The T-shaped pillars represented deified ancestors or spiritual beings, and the absence of domestic structures confirmed a sacred site, not a settlement. Other researchers propose Göbekli Tepe may have functioned as a primitive astronomical observatory. A 2017 study by engineers from the University of Edinburgh analyzed symbols on Pillar 43, known as the vulture stone, and suggested they might represent constellations, though this interpretation remains debated. A third hypothesis focuses on social function. Göbekli Tepe may have been a seasonal gathering place where different bands came to perform rituals, exchange goods, arrange marriages, and build alliances. In a world without writing, without permanent borders, and without shared institutions, a monument this massive may have been the only thing powerful enough to hold people together. Some researchers outside the mainstream have proposed that the site points to a previously unrecognized prehistoric civilization. It is easy to see why the idea appeals. When you stand before a 6-meter pillar carved with surgical precision by people who had no metal tools, the gap between what we assume they could do and what they clearly did feels uncomfortably wide. However, recent archaeological work across southeastern Turkey has revealed a network of contemporary sites, suggesting Göbekli Tepe was part of a broader pattern of monumental construction by late hunter-gatherer communities rather than an isolated anomaly. But perhaps the most significant theory came from Schmidt himself. Religion did not follow agriculture. Religion may have created it. The drive to build and maintain this sacred place forced large groups to concentrate, and that pressure may have pushed them toward farming. Genetic research lends weight to this idea. The earliest domesticated wheat strains originated in the Carnac Mountains, only about 30 kilometers away, at nearly the same period. People did not settle down and then build temples. They built temples, and that forced them to settle down. When I first came across Schmidt's hypothesis, it completely reversed the way I understood the timeline of civilization. We are taught that farming came first and culture followed. Göbekli Tepe suggests it may have been the other way around, and that is a genuinely unsettling idea. And then, after centuries of construction, the builders did something that still lacks a complete explanation. They deliberately buried the entire complex under thousands of tons of earth and rubble, not abandoned, not destroyed by enemies. Carefully and methodically sealed. The burial required nearly as much coordinated labor as the original construction. Imagine a community spending centuries building a cathedral, then choosing to fill it with earth and walk away. Not because they were forced to, but because they believed it was time. What drove hunter-gatherers to build a monument of this scale? What did they believe in so deeply that it could unite rival bands for over 1,000 years? And why, after all that effort, did they choose to bury it? With 95% of the site still underground, the answers may be waiting in the same darkness where the builders left them 11,000 years ago. If Göbekli Tepe makes us question the structure of ancient societies, then the Nazca Lines confront us with a different kind of expression entirely, not a place where people lived or gathered, but a place where they projected belief across an enormous scale. While those ancient builders sealed their temple beneath the soil of Turkey, on the opposite side of the world, another culture was creating something equally difficult to explain, not hidden underground, but spread openly across 450 square kilometers of desert, not carved into stone, but scratched into the earth, and visible only from hundreds of meters in the air, created by people who, as far as we know, had no way to fly. In one of the driest places on Earth, where rain falls barely 4 millimeters per year, someone created one of the largest artworks in human history. Not on canvas, not on walls. Across more than 450 square kilometers of open desert, an area roughly the size of a major city. And the technique was almost absurdly simple. Remove the dark, iron oxide-coated pebbles from the surface to expose the lighter soil beneath. Trenches only 10 to 30 centimeters deep. A child could do it with a stick. Yet that simple method produced a hummingbird stretching 96 meters, longer than a commercial aircraft. A spider 46 meters long, rendered with such anatomical detail that some researchers have suggested it resembles a risinulae, a rare arachnid found deep in the Amazon, hundreds of kilometers away, though this identification remains debated, and many of these figures appear to have been drawn in a single continuous line without crossing themselves from start to finish. The problem is that none of it makes sense from the ground. Walk across these lines and they look like shallow trails in dirt. Their true forms only emerge from hundreds of meters in the air. The people who made them, as far as the evidence shows, had no way to see what they had created. A lot of people ask me, if the creators could never see their own work from above, was this really art, or something closer to ritual? Personally, I lean toward the idea that these figures were a way of connecting spiritually with nature and community, not just giant pictures drawn for their own sake. Local people had walked these lines for centuries, assuming they were ordinary paths. In 1927, Peruvian archaeologist Toribio Mejia Cespe first observed unusual markings from nearby foothills, but the full scale only became clear through aerial surveys in the following years. The mystery truly took shape through the work of Maria Reiche, a German mathematician who spent 52 years alone in the desert, mapping hundreds of drawings with ladders, compasses, and ropes. When modern highways threatened to cut through the figures, she campaigned to have roads rerouted. Her efforts led to UNESCO World Heritage status in 1994. Imagine flying over this desert at dawn. Below you, the pale ground stretches flat to the horizon. Then shapes begin to emerge. A monkey with a spiraling tail drawn in a single unbroken line across 90 meters of sand. A condor with wings spanning over 100 meters. Geometric trapezoids so large they swallow entire hillsides. From up here, the desert reads like a page covered in symbols. But drop back to the ground, and everything vanishes. The lines become faint grooves in gravel. The hummingbird becomes a dusty path you might walk along without ever knowing what you were crossing. This is the central paradox of Nazca. The full forms are most clearly visible from elevated perspectives that were not part of ordinary daily experience for the people who created them. Beyond the famous animal figures, surveys have identified over 800 straight lines, roughly 300 geometric shapes, and more than 70 figurative drawings. Some lines extend for over 20 kilometers with remarkably consistent alignment, climbing hills and crossing peaks across uneven terrain. The scale is measurable. The intention is not. Now imagine drawing a perfectly straight line for 20 kilometers across uneven terrain, without aerial guidance, without surveying equipment, using nothing but cord and wooden stakes. The precision is not mysterious in method. It is staggering in discipline. The lines were created by the Nazca culture, approximately 200 years before to 600 years after the Common Era. Despite the harsh environment, they engineered underground aqueducts called puquios to channel water from deep aquifers, some still functioning today. This was a culture that mastered desert survival, which makes the enormous investment in these drawings all the more puzzling. In a landscape where 4 millimeters of annual rainfall separates survival from death, why dedicate generations of labor to art that you yourself can never fully see? Maria Reiche believed the lines formed a giant astronomical calendar, However, astronomer Gerald Hawkins tested 186 lines by computer and found no consistent pattern beyond what random distribution would allow. Archaeologist Johann Reinhard proposed a more compelling alternative. The lines were not made to be seen from above, but to be walked upon. In Andean tradition, ceremonial walking along sacred paths connects communities to their gods. Broken pottery and ritual spondylus shells found along the lines confirm people walked these paths, leaving offerings. This is the interpretation that changed my perspective entirely. One interpretation suggests the lines were not primarily intended to be viewed from above, but rather to be experienced through ceremonial movement along their paths. Once you accept that possibility, the whole mystery shifts from who was watching from above to what did it feel like to walk the shape of a hummingbird across the desert as a prayer. David Johnson proposed that some lines may trace underground water sources, a hypothesis that remains debated but carries a certain logic in a land where water means everything. The depicted animals support this reading. Spiders appear after rain, hummingbirds symbolize fertility, the killer whale represents the ocean, the ultimate source of all water. Some researchers outside the mainstream have suggested the drawings were intended as markers for observation from above, though by whom remains carefully unspecified. The idea has obvious appeal. Stand on the desert floor and you see nothing. Rise 300 meters and an entire mythology unfolds beneath you. It is hard not to wonder who the intended audience was. But no archaeological evidence supports flight technology in Nazca culture, and the walking ritual hypothesis explains the lines without requiring a viewer in the sky. In 2019, researchers using artificial intelligence analysis of satellite imagery identified more than 140 previously unknown geoglyphs. The true scale of what lies across this desert may be far greater than current estimates. Around 600 years after the Common Era, the Nazca stopped creating new lines. Climate studies indicate devastating drought cycles linked to El Niño during this period. If the lines were prayers for water, their abandonment carries a tragic weight. Perhaps what mattered was never the view from above, but the act itself. Communities walking together, step by step, tracing the shape of a hummingbird across the desert, united in prayer for rain that might never come. After exploring art drawn across a desert, we now turn to a completely different story, Puma Punku, where stonework pushes far beyond any simple explanation. The Nazca shaped their desert with nothing but stones and patience. But high in Bolivia, at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, another civilization was shaping some of the hardest volcanic stone available using tools softer than the material itself. Diorite ranks approximately 7 on the MO's hardness scale, nearly as hard as quartz. To cut it today, engineers typically use diamond-tipped saws or industrial laser systems. Now imagine trying to do it with copper. Copper is softer than a kitchen knife. You could scratch it with a house key. Yet, on the Altiplano highlands of Bolivia, at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, where the air holds 40% less oxygen and every physical task demands significantly more effort, ancient builders shaped diorite and andesite blocks with surfaces that in certain measured sections exhibit remarkably tight tolerances, with precision that some researchers have measured at near millimeter levels. Drill holes only a few centimeters wide, but reaching 20 to 30 centimeters deep, bored straight through near unworkable stone. Several intersections approach right angles with a level of precision that has drawn sustained analytical attention from modern engineers. And the people who did this left no evidence of iron, steel, or wheeled transport. The primary tools identified at the site are copper and copper alloy implements, materials significantly softer than the stone being shaped. The tools we have found do not intuitively match the results we can measure. It means the intermediate techniques, the sand abrasives, the time investment, the embodied skill, carried more weight than our modern intuitions about tooling tend to assume. This contrast forms one of the key technical questions surrounding Puma Punku, highly durable volcanic stone shaped using tools made primarily of copper and copper alloys. This leads me to a bigger question. How was that knowledge and skill passed down? Did Tiwanaku society have a specialized training system, something like a hereditary craft guild, or is this an expression of expertise we do not yet fully understand? When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they found only massive stone blocks scattered across a desolate plain at nearly 4,000 meters altitude. as if some catastrophe had torn apart a great structure. Local inhabitants told them these stones were not made by humans, but by gods in ancient times. Austrian-Bolivian engineer Arthur Poznański began the first serious study in 1903, devoting decades to mapping thousands of blocks. But it was not until the 1960s and 70s, when modern engineers examined the stonework in detail, that the true precision was recognized. Pick up one of the famous H blocks in your mind. Run your hand across the surface. It feels polished, almost glassy. Each block has channels and grooves forming an interlocking system, different pieces fitting together like a stone puzzle, no mortar needed. Some blocks have stone pegs protruding, others have matching grooves to receive them. Eye-shaped holes on some surfaces once held copper or bronze clamps cast in place to lock adjacent blocks together. Now step back and consider the largest foundation block at the site, an estimated 131 tons of sandstone, roughly the weight of a fully loaded Boeing 757. This block was quarried approximately 10 kilometers away. But the andesite and diorite blocks came from quarries on the opposite shore of Lake Titicaca, roughly 90 kilometers across mountainous terrain and open water. Picture hauling a jet aircraft across 90 kilometers of mountains at an altitude where your lungs work at 60% capacity, without wheels, without roads, without engines. That transportation process remains an area of active research and debate. Puma Punku was part of Tiwanaku culture, which flourished from approximately 300 to 1000 Common Era. At its peak, the city supported an estimated 10 to 20,000 people, sustained by an ingenious agricultural system called suka kolus, raised field beds surrounded by water channels that created warmer microclimates to protect crops from frost at this extreme altitude. The complex itself has been dated to approximately 536 to 600 Common Era. The accepted archaeological explanation holds that the Tiwanaku people used copper and bronze tools combined with abrasive quartz sand to gradually grind and polish the stone. Experimental reproductions have demonstrated that this method can produce smooth results given sufficient time. For drilling, researchers propose hand-rotated drills with copper tube bits and sand abrasive. For splitting, wooden wedges driven into drilled holes and soaked with water may have generated enough pressure to fracture blocks along desired lines. The methods are technically feasible, but the time required is staggering. Experiments suggest that achieving comparable precision on even a small surface area demands weeks of continuous grinding. Multiply that across thousands of interlocking blocks, each cut to fit only one specific position, and the labor investment becomes almost incomprehensible. Some researchers outside the mainstream have proposed that the builders possessed stone softening techniques using plant-based chemicals that could temporarily make rock malleable. The idea draws from local legends about plants that could dissolve stone. French researcher Jean-Pierre Protzen investigated these claims in the 1980s, but found no convincing evidence. No chemical or crystallographic trace of post-formation softening has been detected in any Puma Punku block. A third perspective raises what may be the deepest question. The entire complex was planned as a modular interlocking system before any stone was cut. Every block had a predetermined position. This required sophisticated design and communication methods. Yet the Tiwanaku had no known writing system. How complex architectural plans were recorded and transmitted across generations of builders remains an open question. Around 1000 Common Era, Tiwanaku declined rapidly. Likely due to prolonged regional drought, the site was abandoned, and over centuries many blocks were carried away to build houses in nearby towns. And here is perhaps the most unsettling detail. The level of precision displayed at Puma Punku appears not to have been replicated anywhere else in the Andes, before or after. Later civilizations, including the builders of Machu Picchu, developed different masonry traditions entirely. Whatever specific knowledge made this possible may have been held by a small group of specialists. When Tiwanaku collapsed, that knowledge may have vanished with them, like a book that existed in only one copy, burned before anyone thought to make a second. From the ability to shape massive stone, we now turn to something entirely different, a mechanical device smaller than a human yet far more complex. At Puma Punku, ancient builders shaped the hardest stone with tools softer than the material they worked. But beneath the Mediterranean Sea, an even more paradoxical artifact waited 2,000 years to be found. Not a monument, not a temple, a corroded lump of bronze no larger than a shoebox, hiding a level of geared mechanical sophistication not seen again in the surviving Mediterranean record for approximately 15 centuries. It fit in the palm of 2 hands, it was smaller than a shoebox, and it was more mechanically sophisticated than anything that survives in the record for approximately 15 centuries. That is the central paradox of the Antikythera Mechanism, a device whose mechanical sophistication significantly exceeded what was previously assumed possible for its period, built by a civilization we thought we understood, then lost at the bottom of the sea for 2,000 years. When it was finally recovered, no one recognized what it was, and when they did, it forced historians to rethink fundamental assumptions about the technological limits of the ancient world. If the ancient world had technology like this, then why is there so little other evidence? That suggests we may have lost far more knowledge than we realize, not because our ancestors could not create it, but because those achievements were not preserved or were destroyed over time. In April of 1900, a Greek sponge diver named Elias Stadiatis surfaced from 42 meters depth near the tiny island of Antikythera, panicking about dead bodies and horses on the seabed. His captain assumed nitrogen narcosis, but when they investigated, they found not corpses but bronze and marble statues from an ancient shipwreck. Among the recovered objects was a corroded lump of bronze, unremarkable in appearance, roughly the size of a thick book. It was catalogued, placed in storage, and largely forgotten. For over 50 years, it sat in a museum drawer while scholars studied the more visually impressive statues. Then, in 1902, archaeologist Valerios Stias noticed the lump had cracked while drying, revealing what appeared to be gear wheels embedded inside. He proposed it was an astronomical device. The academic world dismissed the idea as impossible for that era. The mechanism was forgotten again until the 1950s, when science historian Derek de Sola Price began serious research. In 1971, X-ray and gamma-ray imaging revealed the internal structure for the first time. Now imagine holding a wooden box roughly 34 by 18 by 9 centimeters, about the size of a large paperback novel. Open the front panel and you see a zodiac ring divided into 360 degrees, with pointers tracking the sun and moon. A small sphere on the moon pointer, half bright and half dark, displays the current lunar phase. Turn it over. 2 spiral dials on the back predict eclipses across cycles of 18 and 19 years. Now look inside. At least 30 bronze gears, some barely larger than a thumbnail, with teeth so fine that a single misaligned tooth would throw off the entire system. One component uses a form of differential gearing that combines separate rotational inputs, a design not clearly documented again in the Western mechanical tradition for many centuries. And across every available surface, more than 3,500 Greek characters, each roughly 2 millimeters tall, essentially a user manual engraved in miniature. Imagine reading instructions written in letters the size of a pinhead, carved into bronze by hand 2,000 years ago. For most of the 20th century, historians of technology assumed that geared mechanical computation in antiquity was, at best, primitive. The mechanism emerged from the Hellenistic period, following Alexander the Great, when Greek science reached extraordinary heights. Hipparchus calculated the solar year accurate to roughly 6.5 minutes and discovered axial precession. Archimedes was recorded as having built mechanical celestial spheres. Most analyses place the device between approximately 150 and 100 years before the Common Era, possibly constructed in Rhodes, Syracuse, or Pergamon. Some researchers propose it was primarily a teaching instrument for demonstrating astronomical cycles. The detailed inscriptions and portable size support this. Others suggest it served as an astrological calculator for determining horoscopes, a common practice among rulers and generals of the period. A third view holds it was a calendar converter, synchronizing the multiple incompatible calendar systems used across the Greek world. Cicero himself described similar devices built by Archimedes and Posidonius, suggesting the mechanism may have been part of a broader tradition rather than a singular miracle. Some researchers outside the mainstream have pointed to the mechanism as evidence that ancient technological capabilities have been systematically underestimated. And here, for once, the mainstream largely agrees. The Antikythera Mechanism is not controversial because of fringe theories. It is controversial because it forces a simple, uncomfortable question. If they could build this, what else did they build that we have never found? And that question leads to the deepest mystery. After the Antikythera Mechanism, no device of comparable geared complexity survives in the Mediterranean record for approximately 15 centuries. Comparable geared devices do not reappear in the surviving Mediterranean record for many centuries, suggesting that this specific technological tradition was not continuously preserved. Bronze was routinely melted down for reuse. Master-apprentice chains were fragile. Roman infrastructure collapsed. If similar devices existed, and Cicero suggests they did, we may be looking at the sole survivor of an entire technological tradition that disappeared without a trace. One device, out of perhaps hundreds, preserved only because a ship sank in the right place at the right depth. Research in 2021 using advanced imaging revealed previously unreadable text and gear details. Scientists continue to discover new features, suggesting the mechanism may have been even more capable than currently understood. We are still learning what a 2,000-year-old computer can teach us. This raises a point. Some knowledge belongs to a single individual or small group, but there are also achievements built by entire communities across generations, like the Carnac Stones. At Antikythera, a single craftsman or small workshop created a miniature marvel of individual genius. But on the Atlantic coast of France, an entirely different kind of mystery awaits. Not the product of one brilliant mind, but of thousands of ordinary people working across more than 1,000 years, raising over 3,000 stones in rows that stretch 4 kilometers, for reasons that no one has yet been able to fully explain. The Antikythera Mechanism was the work of perhaps one brilliant mind. Carnac is the opposite. No single genius, no flash of invention. Instead, thousands of ordinary people, generation after generation, raising stones for over 1,000 years and then stopping, leaving no written record of what they were building or why. That is the contrast that makes Carnac so unsettling. For me, the strangest part is not that thousands of stones were raised, but the continuity of effort across so many generations. There is no clear evidence identifying a single central ruler directing the project. It was a deep cultural thread sustained over centuries, and we still cannot fully explain what held it together. We can admire individual brilliance. We can understand a king ordering a monument, but what compels entire communities across dozens of generations to keep adding stones to rows that their great-great-grandparents began, and their great-great-grandchildren would never see completed? More than 3,000 megaliths stand in parallel rows stretching over 4 kilometers along the coast of Brittany in northwestern France. Some rise nearly 7 meters, the height of a 2-story building. The total mass of stone moved at Carnac amounts to hundreds of thousands of tons, comparable in collective effort to major pyramid construction, yet spread across a millennium rather than a single reign. The people who built this were Neolithic farming communities working with stone tools, wooden rollers, rope, and coordinated muscle. No metal, no writing, no wheels. And unlike the pyramids, which are widely interpreted as royal tombs, no one has established a definitive explanation for why these stones stand in rows. Unlike most archaeological sites, the Carnac stones were never lost. Local Breton people lived among them for millennia, telling legends of Roman soldiers turned to stone by a saint, or giants petrified for their sins. Scientific study began in 1864, when Scottish archaeologist James Milne arrived and spent the rest of his life mapping the alignments. His work was continued by Zachary Larouzic, who documented that many stones had fallen or been carried off by farmers for building material over the centuries. Carbon-14 dating eventually established that the stones were erected between approximately 4,500 and 3,300 years before the Common Era. Now imagine standing at the western end of the Lemenec Alignsampamant. Before you, over 1,000 stones stretch toward the horizon in 11 parallel rows. The nearest stones rise 3 to 4 meters, some reaching 7. But as your eye follows the rows eastward, something strange happens. The stones gradually shrink. 4 meters becomes 2, 2 becomes 1. 1 becomes barely half a meter, like watching giants slowly sink into the earth. This size gradation is consistent and clearly intentional. No one knows what it means. What strikes me here is not the number. It is the consistency. A pattern this deliberate, sustained across a millennium, implies a shared understanding that was never written down and yet never lost, until it was. Nearby, the Kermario group adds another 1,000 stones, and Kurliskan another 555. Scattered among the rows stand more than 100 dolmens and the massive tumulus of Saint Michel, 12 meters high and 125 meters long, roughly the length of a football pitch. Construction spanned over 1,000 years, with successive generations adding to the complex. To grasp that timescale, if Carnac were started today, your descendants would still be raising stones in the year 3000. Whatever purpose drove this effort had to be powerful enough to survive every disruption that a millennium can bring, every drought, every conflict, every generation that might have asked why they should continue what their ancestors began. That is the question I keep returning to with Carnac. Not how they moved the stones, that part we can reconstruct, but what made generation after generation decide that the next stone still mattered. Archaeoastronomer Alexander Thom proposed in the 1970s that the rows aligned with solar and lunar positions at solstices and equinoxes. However, with thousands of stones pointing in many directions, some astronomical alignments would be expected by chance alone. A second theory proposes the rows functioned as ceremonial pathways connecting stone arcs at each end, with nearby dolmens and burial mounds suggesting a symbolic route from the world of the living to the world of the dead. A third hypothesis frames the stones as a display of communal power, permanent territorial markers declaring collective identity across generations. Some researchers outside the mainstream have suggested the alignments encode mathematical or geodetic knowledge more advanced than Neolithic societies are typically credited with. Thom himself proposed a universal unit of measurement he called the megalithic yard. The idea is seductive. Rows stretching with apparent regularity across kilometers do invite the suspicion of hidden order. But statistical analysis has not confirmed a consistent unit across the site, and most archaeologists consider the evidence insufficient. By around 3,000 years before the Common Era, large-scale construction at Carnac declined significantly. Whether this was triggered by the arrival of metal technology, climate shifts, or social transformation remains unclear. The size gradation of the stones, tall in the west, diminishing eastward, hints at deliberate symbolic meaning. Perhaps a journey from this world to the next. Perhaps something no living person can reconstruct from stones alone. The Celts, the Romans, the medieval Bretons, all lived among these rows without knowing who placed them or why. The stones simply became part of the landscape, like the hills and the sea, 1,000 years of human effort, absorbed into silence. If at Carnac we see the expression of a vast community, then Mohenjo-Daro raises a different question entirely. How did a civilization function without any clearly identifiable king or ruling elite? At Carnac, thousands of people across dozens of generations shaped a landscape with raw stone and collective will. But in the Indus River Valley, a single civilization built something strikingly different. Planned cities with grid streets, private bathing facilities, and engineered drainage, all functioning centuries before Rome, then gradually abandoned, leaving behind a script that no one alive can read. Around 2,600 years before the Common Era, while Egypt was raising its first pyramids and Mesopotamia was developing early writing, a city in the Indus River Valley had already developed urban sanitation systems of a sophistication not widely paralleled for many centuries. Private bathing facilities in individual homes, waste channeled through clay pipes into covered street-level drains, a standardized brick system with a consistent ratio of approximately 1 to 2 to 4, identical in proportion at sites separated by hundreds of kilometers, as if an entire civilization had agreed on a single building code and enforced it across a territory comparable in scale to large regions of Western Europe. And then it all stopped. The cities declined, the people dispersed, and the script they left behind, found on thousands of objects, has never been deciphered. Whatever they believed, however they governed themselves, whatever stories they told, all of it remains locked inside symbols no one alive can read. For nearly 3,800 years, Mohenjo-Daro lay buried under the plains of Sindh in present-day Pakistan. Local villagers had been digging its ancient bricks for construction material for generations without knowing what lay beneath. In 1922, Indian archaeologist Rakhaldas Bandyopadhyay investigated what locals believed was a Buddhist stupa, and discovered something far older underneath. British archaeologist John Marshall subsequently led large-scale excavations, revealing a carefully planned city that may have housed up to 40,000 residents, part of a civilization extending across roughly 1 million square kilometers. Now imagine walking into this city. The streets run in a precise grid, main roads approximately 10 meters wide, broad enough for 2 lanes of modern traffic. Secondary streets branch at right angles. Step inside a typical house, a central courtyard, multiple rooms, a private well, and a bathing area with a brick floor sloped toward a drain connecting to the city sewage network. Every surface is built from those standardized bricks. Now consider the scale of that standardization. A builder in Mohenjo-Daro and a builder at Harappa, over 500 kilometers away, used bricks of the same proportions. No telephone, no written specifications that we can read. No clearly identifiable centralized authority has yet been confirmed through the archaeological record. This makes me wonder, without a clear centralized authority, how did they maintain construction standards and communication across such a vast territory? This is one of the great puzzles in archaeology, and I find it absolutely fascinating. Yet somehow, across a territory roughly the size of Western Europe, the standard held. Walk to the center and you reach the Great Bath, roughly 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and 2.5 meters deep, about the size of a large modern swimming pool. It is lined with precisely fitted bricks sealed with natural bitumen, waterproofing so effective that it still impresses hydraulic engineers today. No crown jewels, no grand throne room. The most important structure in this city was a pool. The Indus Valley civilization flourished from approximately 2600 to 1900 years before the Common Era, encompassing over 1,000 settled communities. And here is what makes it deeply unusual among Bronze Age civilizations. Archaeologists have not identified clearly defined palaces or royal tombs. Large-scale depictions of warfare or monuments to individual rulers have not been conclusively found. Whatever held this society together, it does not appear to have been the usual combination of kings, armies, and conquest. Some archaeologists propose collective leadership, perhaps a council of merchants or civic administrators. The remarkable standardization across vast distances supports some form of coordination, but its nature remains debated. Others suggest religious authority centered on ritual purity and water symbolism. The Great Bath and elaborate drainage may reflect spiritual practice rather than purely practical engineering. Gregory Possehl proposed a more radical model, a civilization operating through shared cultural norms and trade relationships rather than top-down political control, what he described as a stateless civilization. Some researchers outside the mainstream have suggested connections to Vedic texts describing advanced ancient cities. The appeal is understandable. Here is a civilization with urban planning that rivals Rome, yet we cannot name a single one of its rulers, read a single one of its sentences, or explain with confidence how it governed itself. The temptation to fill that silence with familiar narratives is strong, but no direct archaeological link between Mohenjo-Daro and Vedic literature has been established. Around 1900 years before the Common Era, the city entered a period of gradual decline. Climate studies indicate shifts in monsoon patterns and possible changes in river courses. Some sites show reduced maintenance and population decrease over generations rather than sudden catastrophe. The earlier theory of violent Aryan invasion has been largely abandoned due to lack of supporting evidence. But the deepest mystery is the script. Over 4,000 inscribed objects have been found, yet the average text contains fewer than 5 symbols. Without a bilingual key, the Indus script remains undeciphered. Imagine a library of 4,000 books where every book contains only a single sentence, and the language has no living relative. That image has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this series. That is what scholars face. An entire civilization speaking to us across 4,000 years in a voice we cannot yet understand. Humans can build order without kings, and they can also create massive stone figures for purposes that no longer survive intact. And Easter Island is the clearest proof of that. Mohenjo-Daro vanished into the earth, its voice locked in undeciphered symbols. But on the most remote inhabited island on Earth, over 2,000 kilometers from the nearest continent, a small community left behind something that needs no translation. Nearly 900 stone figures, each one staring silently inland, monuments so massive that how they were moved still divides engineers today. Over 2,000 kilometers from the nearest continent, on one of the most isolated inhabited islands on Earth, a community of just a few thousand people carved nearly 900 monumental stone figures from volcanic rock. Some stand nearly 10 meters tall, the height of a 3-story building. Some weigh approximately 80 tons, roughly the weight of a fully loaded freight train car. And nearly 400 additional figures remain unfinished in the quarry at Rano-Raraku, some still attached to the bedrock, as if the carvers set down their tools one day and never came back. That is the first paradox of Easter Island. And what fascinates me most about Easter Island is not just the engineering behind moving the statues, but the collective belief that drove the effort, a conviction so powerful it could shape an entire society. The second is how they moved them. The third is why they stopped. When Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday 1722, he found a population of perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 living among toppled statues. Many moai had been deliberately knocked face down. European observers recorded that islanders offered varying explanations for the statues, though these accounts were filtered through layers of translation and cultural misunderstanding. Some claimed the statues had walked to their positions through divine power. Later visitors noted the island had few remaining large trees, prompting a question that would fuel debate for centuries. If the statues were moved using timber, what happened to the forests? Imagine standing in the quarry at Rano-Raraku. Dozens of partially carved moai emerge from the volcanic tuff at various stages of completion. Some faces are fully detailed, others barely roughed out. Tools lie scattered nearby, as if work stopped mid-stroke. The largest unfinished figure, often called El Gigante, stretches approximately 21 meters in length, roughly the height of a 7-story building. If fully detached and erected, it would have weighed an estimated 145 to 165 tons. Now ask yourself a practical question. You have no cranes, no metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals. Your entire island population could fill a single modern sports stadium with empty seats to spare. How do you move even one of these figures across kilometers of uneven volcanic terrain? And why would you carve nearly 900 of them? Polynesian settlers arrived on Rapa Nui, the island's indigenous name, likely between approximately 800 and 1200 of the Common Era. Pollen core studies indicate the island was once covered with palm forests. Over several centuries, significant ecological changes occurred, including substantial reduction in forest coverage. However, the relative contributions of human clearing introduced species such as Polynesian rats that consumed palm seeds, and climatic variability remain under active investigation. The older narrative of reckless self-destruction has given way to a more complex picture of a society adapting to compounding pressures. Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl proposed in the 1950s that the moai were moved using wooden sledges and log rollers, requiring extensive timber. This model linked statue transport directly to deforestation. More statues meant fewer trees, until neither could be sustained. In 2011, archaeologists Carl Lipo and Terry Hunt proposed a radically different hypothesis supported by experimental evidence. The moai were designed to be moved upright, rocked side to side using ropes in a walking motion. In controlled experiments, a small team maneuvered a scaled stone replica forward using this technique. If correct, the statues literally walked, not through divine power as the legends claimed, but through elegant physics. The slightly forward-leaning center of gravity, the rounded base, the tapered body, all features that earlier researchers dismissed as aesthetic choices may have been engineering decisions. The oral tradition was not myth. It was a technical description that we misunderstood for centuries. This is probably my favorite moment in the entire series. For centuries, we dismissed the local tradition as superstition. Modern engineering experiments have demonstrated that elements of the oral tradition may reflect practical transport techniques rather than purely symbolic storytelling. It makes me wonder how many other oral traditions we are still misreading. Joanne van Tilburg proposed a third model, horizontal transport on wooden sledges along prepared roads, with ramp and lever systems for final placement. Each hypothesis implies different resource demands and different conclusions about the island's ecological history. Some researchers outside the mainstream have pointed to the uniformity and sheer number of moai as evidence of knowledge not yet fully understood. And there is something genuinely disorienting about standing on an island this small and seeing nearly 900 identical figures staring inland with empty eyes. The scale feels disproportionate to the population, like finding a cathedral in a village of 50 people. But disproportionate effort in the service of belief is not unique to Easter Island. It is one of the most consistent patterns in human history. Between approximately the 15th and 18th centuries, most standing moai were intentionally toppled. Whether this resulted from internal conflict, shifting religious beliefs, or resource pressures remains debated. The Birdman cult eventually replaced moai worship, suggesting a profound cultural transformation. A society that had defined itself through stone giants chose, or was forced, to abandon that identity entirely. Perhaps the deepest question Easter Island raises is not about engineering. It is about choice. What drives a small, isolated community to pour generations of labor into 900 stone figures? And what breaks that drive so completely that the majority of them were eventually toppled? The statues remain, staring inland with hollow eyes, monuments to a faith that once moved stones across an island, and then, for reasons we may never fully recover, fell silent. We began on a barren hilltop in Turkey, where hunter-gatherers built a temple before they built farms, then buried it under thousands of tons of earth. We crossed a desert in Peru, where an entire mythology was drawn across 450 square kilometers of ground by people who could never see what they had made. We climbed to 4,000 meters in Bolivia, where builders shaped some of the hardest volcanic stone with tools softer than a kitchen knife. We held a corroded lump of bronze that concealed a level of mechanical sophistication not seen again in surviving records for approximately 15 centuries. We walked among 3,000 stones raised across a millennium by people who left no explanation. We entered a city with engineered sanitation that preceded Rome by 2,000 years, whose script no one alive can read. And we stood on the most remote island on Earth, where a few thousand people carved 900 stone giants, moved them across volcanic terrain, and then saw the majority of them intentionally toppled. 7 sites, 6 continents, thousands of years apart, and yet a single thread connects them all. In every case, the evidence is real, measurable, and carefully excavated. In every case, the full explanation remains just out of reach. These were societies operating within their own technological and environmental contexts, demonstrating organizational and technical capabilities supported by archaeological evidence. They were communities that organized labor on enormous scales, transmitted complex knowledge across generations without writing, and invested lifetimes of effort into projects whose purposes we are still debating. The gap between what we assume they could do and what they clearly did is not a mystery to be solved with aliens or lost magic. It is a reminder that human capability has never been limited to what we expect. Perhaps the deepest lesson is not about stone or bronze or engineering. It is about what people will do when something matters enough. Build for 1,000 years, walk a prayer across a desert, carve a mountain into a god, bury a temple so that it might be found again 11,000 years later by someone willing to look beneath the surface. Across these 7 stories, I see one common thread. Curiosity, belief, and the ability to organize are what create wonders. And perhaps the most valuable thing is not the final answer, but the questions we still cannot resolve. Of the 7 mysteries we explored today, which one changed the way you think about the past the most? Share your thoughts below. I genuinely want to read them. If there are other ancient sites or unresolved questions you would like explored in future episodes, share them below. And if you would like to continue examining the archaeological record, select the next video on your screen. Thank you for listening.